My name is Victoria Ashley. I'm 34 years old, and I'm speaking to you from Virginia, though that wasn't always home. 7 years ago, I was someone else entirely. I was smaller, quieter. I was the kind of woman who apologized for taking up space. Today, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not my therapist. Not my closest friends. Not even my family, who watched this story unfold and couldn't fully comprehend what was happening beneath the surface. This is the story of how I learned that the greatest revenge isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about becoming so undeniably brilliant that their absence becomes irrelevant. But before I continue, I want to know where you are right now. Are you listening from your car, during your commute? From your bedroom, where maybe you're also trying to figure out your own escape route? Are you at work, stealing a few minutes of courage from my words? Or are you somewhere quiet, somewhere you've claimed as your own? The place where you go to remember that you're still in there, somewhere, beneath all the weight? Wherever you are, I want you to know that this story is for you. For anyone who's ever been convinced they were nothing. For anyone who's been told that love meant disappearing. For anyone who's had their potential weaponized against them, their dreams reframed as selfishness, their ambition called narcissism. This is what happened when I decided to find out who I really was. Let me take you back. Not to the beginning of my marriage. That's not where this story really starts. This story starts in 2016 in a small consulting firm in Denver, Colorado, where I was the ambitious daughter of a blue-collar family from rural New Mexico. My father was a carpenter. My mother worked double shifts as a nurse to help support 3 kids. I was the oldest, and I was the one who was supposed to make it, not make it out because I never felt like I was running from something. But make it in the sense that I was supposed to reach higher.
To build something.
To prove that our name could mean something in rooms we'd never been to before.
I was good at my job.
Scary good. I had this ability to look at the broken systems clients built their entire companies on and see not the problem, but the opportunity. I could walk into a room full of executives twice my age and articulate solutions they'd been circling around for months. By 2016, I was on track to make partner by 32. The firm had already started grooming me for it. That was the year I met Samuel. He was brought in as a consulting senior manager for a 6-month project. He was 11 years older than me, which I didn't think much of at the time. He had this quality that seemed like confidence but was actually something more like certainty. He didn't ask questions, he made pronouncements. He didn't listen so much as he waited for his turn to speak. But he made me feel seen. That was his superpower, actually. He had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, but only in the specific ways that benefited him. He asked about my work. He remembered details I'd mentioned once and brought them up weeks later. He laughed at my jokes in this way that made me feel like I was brilliant instead of just funny. He told me I was special. I now understand that special was the mechanism. Special meant dependent. Special meant isolated. Special meant that I was different from everyone else. Better in some ways, certainly, but also inherently separate. Special didn't mean I belonged. It meant I was categorized, cataloged, and therefore could be managed. We dated for 9 months. By the time he proposed, and yes, he proposed, no question marks about it, I was already beginning to reorganize my life around his presence. I didn't notice it happening. That's the thing about slow erosion. You only see it when you look at where the ground used to be. He wanted me to leave Denver. His job was ending, and he had an opportunity in Virginia. A bigger firm. More prestigious. He painted it as an adventure for both of us. A fresh start. What I didn't notice at the time was that my career trajectory, which had been so carefully constructed, wasn't going to transfer. The partnership track I'd been on didn't follow me across states. But I was in love. Or I thought I was. I now know that what I was experiencing was the disorientation of someone whose sense of self was already beginning to fragment. Love mixed with anxiety, mixed with the desperate need to prove that leaving everything behind was worth it. We got married in 2017, 3 months after we moved to Virginia. A small ceremony. A lot of his colleagues. A few of my friends who'd made the effort. My parents, who flew in and looked around Virginia with the expression of people who'd entered a foreign country without a visa. I want to be very clear about something. Samuel was not the kind of abusive person you see in movies. He never raised his hand to me. He never called me names, not directly, anyway. He never locked me in a room or forbade me from leaving. He was far too intelligent for such crude methods. His abuse was architectural. It was something he built, carefully, over time, with me helping him lay every brick. The first year was still relatively intact. I was working as a consultant at a different firm in Virginia, and I was doing well, but not too well. Here's what I started noticing. Samuel had opinions about my success. Opinions presented as concern. Observations framed as affection. When I came home excited about landing a large client, he'd ask me why I was traveling for the engagement when I could do the initial consultations remotely. Wasn't I worried about work-life balance? He'd read this article about how ambitious women were burning out. Didn't I want to protect my health? When I'd spend an evening working on a proposal, he'd make a comment about how the firm must really be running him ragged too if his spouse was working late on other people's problems. This is called concern trolling, I later learned. It's when someone uses the language of care to communicate criticism. It's perfect because you can't actually argue against it. What are you going to say? That you don't want to protect your health? That you don't care about work-life balance? The trap is built into the structure of the concern itself. Then came the financial restructuring. Samuel made more money than me, substantially more. He was in investment management, and he had a talent for it. He proposed that we simplify our finances. Put everything into a joint account that he would manage. It made sense, he said. It would be simpler. I wouldn't have to worry about bills. He would handle it. I said yes. What I didn't understand was that financial control is one of the most effective forms of control because it answers the question, can you leave, with a concrete answer. No, not without poverty. When I wanted something, money for the dermatologist, money to take a friend out for dinner, money to contribute to my mother's medical expenses, I had to ask. I had to hear his thoughts on whether the expenditure was necessary. In 2018, I became pregnant. This was not the plan. I'd wanted to wait, to establish myself in Virginia to build my career at the new firm. But Samuel had stopped using contraception without telling me. When I found out, I was terrified and confused and angry, but I was also already emotionally fatigued from 2 years of constant, low-level criticism. When I expressed concern about the timing, Samuel reframed it. He said he wanted our child to have a present mother. He said my career was consuming me. He said, maybe I should think about whether my ambition was worth it. Worth what? I asked. Worth everything, he said, looking at me in that way he had, like he was solving an equation. I miscarried at 17 weeks. At my follow-up appointment, my OB/GYN asked if I was in a safe relationship. I remember the question hanging in that sterile room, and I remember feeling deeply offended. Of course I was safe. Samuel had been wonderful during the miscarriage. He'd taken time off work. He'd brought me flowers. He'd told me how much he wanted to be a father with me, someday, when the timing was right. It took me another 6 years to understand what that doctor was really asking. Here's something I didn't talk about for years. I stopped creating. In 2016, before I met Samuel, I was writing. Not anything professional. I was working full-time in consulting, but I was writing in the evenings. Essays mostly. Long-form personal essays about ambition and class and women trying to make it in spaces that weren't designed for us. I had a blog. It wasn't popular, but it was read. Maybe 800 followers, people who really engaged with what I was saying. I stopped after I married Samuel. Not because he forbade it. Not because he said stop writing. But because I had less time, less energy, and when I did sit down to write, his presence in the house felt like pressure. He'd make a comment about me being absorbed in my own thoughts again. He'd suggest I take a break, spend time with him. Why was I always so focused on external validation through publishing anyway? By 2019, I had stopped completely. I told myself I'd return to it. I told myself I was in a season of life where building a stable family was the priority. I told myself many things that made me feel like I was making choices, when actually choices were being made for me by 1,000 small surrenders. My circle of friends contracted. This happened so gradually that I didn't notice until I was well into isolation. Samuel would make observations about certain friends, not judgments, always framed as observations. Maggie was too negative. Mitchell was flighty. Ren was the type to encourage me toward bad decisions. Soon I was seeing them less. Then not at all. I told myself I was outgrowing them. That's what Samuel said I was doing anyway. Outgrowing them. The implication was that if I was seeing someone, it was because I was standing still too. By the time I realized the implication was deliberate and the observation was manipulation, I couldn't contact these people. The shame was too large. At my job, things began to shift as well, but in a different direction. I was becoming increasingly valuable to my firm. By 2019, I was being brought into strategic meetings. I was being asked to mentor younger consultants. My work was being noticed beyond Virginia. There were conversations about whether I might want to go back to Denver or move to the San Francisco office. When I told Samuel about the potential move to San Francisco, there was a long silence. Then he told me that he'd taken a position as a partner at his firm. He'd made partner, which was an incredible achievement for his age and experience level. But it was contingent on him staying in Virginia for at least 5 years. He said he was so sorry. He knew this meant I couldn't take the San Francisco opportunity, and he felt terrible about limiting my potential like this. Here's what I want you to understand about emotional manipulation of this caliber. It works because it incorporates the truth. He had made partner. That was real. The 5-year contingency was real. His regret about my missed opportunity might have even been real, in some twisted way. The manipulation wasn't in the lie. It was in the architecture. It was in having made a major life decision without consulting me, then positioning it as something that affected me and expressing remorse about it, which put me in a position where my response could only be acceptance and support. If I expressed disappointment or anger, I was selfish, ungrateful for his incredible achievement. If I suggested that perhaps we could have discussed it, I was controlling, trying to run his life. So my response was what it had to be. I congratulated him. I told him it didn't matter. I told him we'd be fine. We'd make it work. I didn't pursue the San Francisco opportunity. I didn't pursue anything, actually. I became more cautious at work. I stopped volunteering for projects that would require travel. I made myself smaller. Not obviously. I was still successful, still respected, still considered someone with potential. But I was moving against my own trajectory, fighting against the momentum that was trying to carry me forward. By 2020, when the pandemic hit and the world shuttered, I told myself I should be grateful. I was grateful, actually. The pandemic meant I could work from home. I could be present for Samuel. I could help with the house, maintain the space, create something stable while the world fell apart outside. What I didn't realize was that I was about to lose any external structure that had been holding me up. The pandemic did something to our marriage. It compressed it. Suddenly, there were no more professional obligations that took Samuel away from the house. No more after-work drinks with colleagues. No more golf outings on Saturday. He was home. Constantly. And I was supposed to welcome this. My job went remote, which was both a relief and a nightmare. A relief, because I could work. A nightmare because my office was the second bedroom of our house, and it had glass doors, which meant that while I was on calls, Samuel could see and hear everything. He could, and did, interrupt. Not aggressively. Just a tap on the glass, a gesture, a question that could absolutely wait but was being asked anyway. I started apologizing to my colleagues for interruptions. It became this thing. I'm working from home, so please excuse any background noise. Samuel thought it was funny. He'd make these comments about how busy my work must be if everyone was apologizing for household sounds. Why did my job require such intense focus anyway? Was it really that demanding? Then came the argument that changed everything. It was June 2020. I was on a Zoom call with my team, and we were discussing a strategy shift for a client. I was the lead on this project. I was explaining my recommendation when Samuel opened the glass door and told me his lunch was ready. I held up a finger. One finger, the universal signal for 1 minute. I was in the middle of a sentence. He closed the door. I finished my recommendation. My team agreed. We moved on. The meeting ended. And then I went to the kitchen and he was standing there and he told me that I'd embarrassed him. I'd embarrassed him by holding up my finger in front of other people, even though those people were on a screen and weren't actually present. I'd made him feel like he was unimportant, less valuable than a work call. I'd treated him like he was insignificant. I apologized. That's what I did. I apologized and I said I'd been disrespectful. I explained that I was just trying to finish the thought, that it wasn't about him, that he was obviously more important to me than work. And even as I was saying it, I could feel the trap forming around me, but I couldn't figure out which direction to walk to escape it. That night, he told me I should take some time off work. Not a day.
Time.
He said the pandemic was clearly taking a toll on me. I was becoming difficult. I was anxious. I wasn't present. Maybe I needed a break. Maybe I needed to focus on myself for once instead of always chasing the next thing. What I heard was, "You're failing at being what I need you to be, and it's because you're working too hard." What was actually being communicated was, "Your professional identity is a problem. Your success is a threat. I want you to give it up." I took a leave of absence from my job. I told my team I needed to manage some personal matters. I was vague about it. They were accommodating. It was 2020, and everyone understood that the pandemic had created circumstances that required flexibility. I took 2 weeks off. Then 2 more weeks. By September, I'd been gone so long that when I tried to return, it felt impossible. There had been staffing changes. I'd been removed from active projects. I'd been replaced. My firm offered me a different position when I tried to return in October. A more flexible role. Less travel. Less pressure. Less everything, including less money and less trajectory. I accepted it because I was terrified. Terrified of losing my job entirely. Terrified of Samuel's disappointment if I argued. Terrified of becoming unemployable. By December 2020, I was not the same person I'd been in January. I want to explain what happened in the space between who I was and who I was becoming. This is important because understanding the mechanics of deterioration is the first step toward understanding recovery. By the end of 2020, I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. That sounds like a metaphor, but I want to be literal about it. I would see my reflection and feel a moment of disorientation. That person looked like me, but she wasn't moving like me. She wasn't making eye contact like me. She wasn't taking up space like me. My weight had fluctuated. Pandemic weight, Samuel called it, in that particular tone of his that made a simple observation feel like an indictment. I'd gained about 30 pounds over the year and a half of my marriage, which is not particularly remarkable or significant in any actual way. But in Samuel's commentary on it, it became evidence. Evidence of what? I wasn't entirely sure. Evidence of self-neglect, perhaps. Evidence that without his guidance, I was allowing myself to deteriorate. I started restricting food. Nothing that would be obvious enough that anyone would notice. Just smaller portions. Skipping breakfast. Saying I wasn't hungry. By the spring of 2021, I'd lost all 30 pounds and another 10. I told myself it was for health. I told myself I felt better. What I was actually doing was making myself smaller in every possible way. My mother called me in April 2021. She said I sounded different on the phone. Less like myself. She said my father had commented that I seemed withdrawn in our video calls. She asked me very carefully if everything was okay with Samuel. She didn't know the words to ask what she was really asking, which was, "Are you being hurt?" I told her I was fine. I was tired from work, and the pandemic had been a lot, and I was probably just adjusting to the new role. I didn't mention that the new role was half the responsibility and paid 20% less. I didn't mention the leave of absence or the reason for it. I didn't mention any of the things that would have worried her because I'd already made the decision that she couldn't help, and therefore her worry was a burden I didn't want to place on her. That was the thing about Samuel's particular style of abuse. It isolated me not just from my social circle, but from people who might have recognized what was happening and had the authority, both internally for me and externally in the relationship, to push back. My parents would have demanded answers. My close friends would have offered perspective. My therapist, if I'd had one, would have identified the patterns. So I made sure I didn't have access to any of those people. By the middle of 2021, I was working 30 hours a week in a position that didn't challenge me, making about 60% of what I'd made before, and I was spending the rest of my time maintaining the house and managing Samuel's needs. I took his shirts to the dry cleaner. I made his dinner. I organized his schedule. I existed in a kind of perpetual service that I'd convinced myself was a choice. The money situation had become even more controlled. Samuel had actually suggested that since I was working less, I might not need access to as much cash. We could adjust my allowance. He was still managing everything, still making the decisions about what was necessary and what was frivolous. I wasn't allowed to question it because, he'd point out, I'd agreed to this arrangement years ago. I'd agreed. That was the key. At every step, I'd agreed. I'd agreed to the joint account. I'd agreed to stay in Virginia instead of going to San Francisco. I'd agreed to take a leave from work. I'd agreed to the reduced income. Each agreement felt consensual in the moment, but they'd been engineered to feel like I had no choice while technically maintaining the fiction that I did. The crack appeared on a Thursday in July 2021. I was having lunch with my mother. She'd come to Virginia for a week. She was staying in a hotel because there wasn't space for her to stay with us. Our house was full, Samuel had explained, and really, she'd be more comfortable in a hotel anyway. My mother had eaten lunch with me 3 times during that week, and each time I'd felt myself performing the role of a woman who was fine. But that Thursday, I was sitting in a quiet restaurant with her and she ordered me a glass of wine, and she looked at me in a way that my mother has always been able to look at me, a way that sees straight through all the pretense to the actual person underneath. She said, "You don't have to tell me anything. But I need you to know that if you want to leave, you can." I said, "Leave what?" And she looked at me, and I could see in her expression that she'd just understood something. She'd understood that I didn't even have the language to conceptualize what was happening. I couldn't leave because I didn't have the framework to understand that there was anything to leave. That was what she saw in that moment. I spent the rest of lunch trying to convince her I was happy. My marriage was fine. Samuel was a good man. We were adjusting to the pandemic together. Everything was normal. I did a good job convincing her, I think. Good enough that she didn't press further. Good enough that she dropped it. But the words she'd planted had germinated. They were growing. They were pushing through the carefully constructed landscape I'd built, and I couldn't stop them. That night, after I dropped my mother at her hotel, I went home, and I did something I'd stopped doing years ago. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I tried to remember what I'd wanted. Not what Marcus wanted. Not what was convenient for him. What did I want? The question was so foreign that I couldn't access the answer. It was like trying to recall a conversation you had in another language. I knew the conversation had happened. I knew there had been a me who knew what she wanted. But that person was so far away that I couldn't reach her. The breakthrough didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. A therapy appointment, the first I'd had in 3 years, where I mentioned, almost casually, that Samuel had opinions about what I wore. The therapist asked if he ever forbade me from wearing certain things. I said no. She asked if he made me feel ashamed about what I wore. I said yes. She wrote that down, and I watched her write it, and something in my chest shifted. That therapist would become important later. But at that moment, I wasn't ready to hear what she was trying to tell me. I was still too invested in the narrative that this was marriage. This was compromise. This was what happened when you committed your life to someone. August 2021 was when things began to accelerate. Samuel announced, not proposed, announced that we should try for a baby. I'd thought the miscarriage had ended that conversation, but apparently, he'd decided the time was right now. He'd been researching fertility optimization. He'd developed a plan. I should stop using birth control immediately. I should start tracking my cycle. I should optimize my nutrition and fitness for fertility. What I should do. What I should stop. What I should optimize. It was all phrased in terms that sounded almost helpful, almost like he was trying to support my fertility journey. But what he was actually doing was taking over another area of my bodily autonomy. He was making decisions about my body without permission, under the guise of planning something we'd decide together. I told him I didn't want children. I said it clearly. I said I wasn't ready. I said I didn't think our marriage was in a place where it was wise to add that complexity. He told me I was being selfish. He told me that my resistance to motherhood was clearly rooted in my ambition, and that my ambition had already cost us the partnership opportunities one could have leveraged for him. He told me that maybe the problem wasn't his wanting a child. Maybe the problem was that I was fundamentally unable to put anyone's needs before my own. He told me he'd married me hoping I would grow out of this phase of being so self-centered, but apparently, he'd been wrong. That night, I realized something. I was terrified of having a child with this man. Not in the abstract sense. In the literal, visceral sense that I understood, on some level my conscious mind hadn't articulated, that having a child would make leaving impossible. A child meant entanglement. A child meant he would have legal claim to be part of my life forever. A child meant the decision I was starting to realize I needed to make, the decision to leave, would become exponentially more complicated. I went back to my therapist. I told her about the pressure to have a child. I told her about the financial control. I told her about the isolation. I told her about coming home from work and feeling like I was entering a place that wasn't mine. And I told her something I'd been unable to articulate before. I told her that I was afraid of my husband. She didn't express shock.
She didn't seem surprised.
She simply said, "That tells me everything I need to know about whether your relationship is safe." September 2021 was when I began to see Samuel clearly, possibly for the first time. I'd been reading about coercive control while pretending I was just casually browsing psychology articles. I was reading about financial abuse while telling myself I was just gathering information for general knowledge. I was reading about reproductive coercion and seeing my exact situation described by researchers and survivors, and I was experiencing this strange bifurcation. I could see what was happening to me while simultaneously being unable to fully accept it. But the real moment of clarity came when I accidentally saw his phone. I wasn't snooping. I genuinely wasn't. His phone was on the kitchen counter, and a notification came through. I saw it because it was displaying on his lock screen. The notification was from a dating app. Not just a dating app, a specific app for affairs. I saw the notification, and then my brain short-circuited because it couldn't process what it was seeing. He came into the kitchen, saw me staring at his phone, and his entire demeanor changed. This is important. The man who'd spent 5 years doing everything through implication and concern trolling suddenly dropped the mask entirely. He picked up his phone, looked at the notification I'd seen, and turned to me with this expression of complete contempt. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I saw the notification." And he said, and, like I was being absurd for even acknowledging what I'd witnessed. I asked him what he was doing on a dating app. He laughed. He actually laughed, and then he said something that in a strange way was almost clarifying. "You stopped being interesting to me about 2 years ago. You became this depressing, anxious version of yourself. You're boring. Your body is boring. Your job is boring. I needed something else." What he was describing, the ways in which I'd become boring and depressing, were the direct result of what he'd systematically done to me. He'd isolated me, controlled me, monitored me, reduced my sense of self, and then he was criticizing me for becoming exactly what systematic abuse creates, a diminished, anxious, depressed version of myself. And then, and this is the moment I want you to understand very clearly, he didn't apologize. He didn't try to repair things. He moved toward me, and his entire physical presence shifted. He became larger somehow. Not in size, but in intent. He said, "If you say anything to anyone about this, I will make sure you regret it. I will take everything. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I know people. I have resources. You have nothing without me. You understand that, don't you? Nothing." That's the moment I finally understood what I'd been married to. Not a person. A strategic operation designed to neutralize my threat. Because I had been a threat. At 16, at 22, at 28, I had been someone with trajectory, with potential, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're capable. He'd married that woman, and he'd spent 5 years dismantling her, and when he'd gotten bored with the process, he'd started looking elsewhere. I said, "Okay."
That's all I said.
Okay. I wasn't agreeing to stay silent. I was buying time. I was becoming the person I needed to be to survive the next 5 minutes, which was all I could think about in that moment. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in our bed while Sam slept, and I made a list in my head of everything I'd have to do to leave safely. Because I did understand, on some fundamental level, that he wasn't going to let me go quietly. He'd made his threat explicit, but more than that, he'd revealed his capacity for it. A man who could so coldly explain that I was nothing to him, that was a man capable of anything. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. Not immediately. I was too afraid that he'd find out and accelerate his threats. So, I spent September and October doing everything I needed to do with absolute secrecy. I opened a bank account at a different bank, using my maiden name. I transferred money. Not a lot, just small amounts he wouldn't notice, skimmed from the household account. $20 here, $50 there. It sounds small, but over 6 weeks, I gathered about $2,000. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was the first thing that was unambiguously mine in 5 years. I contacted a divorce attorney. I did this during my lunch breaks at work, sitting in my car in a parking garage. I told the attorney I needed to know what my options were. The attorney asked about assets, debt, financial arrangements. The attorney asked about children. The attorney asked about abuse. I said I couldn't prove it, but I felt unsafe. The attorney said, "Does he control your finances?" I said yes. The attorney said, "That's proof." We discussed strategy. The attorney advised me not to leave until I had everything in place. She advised me to document everything. She advised me to be very careful because the moment I filed, he would know, and then all bets were off. She gave me a list of things to gather. Copies of financial documents, proof of accounts, passwords, anything that would demonstrate the degree to which he controlled our finances and therefore controlled me. I spent my evenings photographing documents while Sam watched television in the other room. I wrote down passwords and account numbers on paper I kept hidden in a book on my shelf. I sent secure emails to myself with screenshots of financial records. I was gathering evidence of my own subjugation. I also did something that now seems obvious, but at the time felt terrifying. I started reaching out to the friends I'd abandoned over the years. Not in person. Through messages. I contacted Maggie first. We'd been extremely close before Sam systematically convinced me she was a bad influence. I sent her a long message explaining everything, or not everything because I couldn't quite explain everything, but enough that she understood something was wrong. She responded immediately. She said she'd been waiting years to hear from me. She said she'd always wondered what happened, why I'd disappeared. She said she was available, whenever I needed, for whatever I needed. I cried when I read that. I cried for hours. I cried for all the years I'd convinced myself that she was the problem, that my isolation was actually just growth and evolution, and the natural result of maturing beyond high school friendships. I cried because I understood that I'd been participating in my own isolation, and that participation had been weaponized against me, and now I had to undo all of it. By November 2021, I had a support system forming in the shadows. Maggie knew. My therapist knew. My divorce attorney knew. My parents didn't know yet, but I was preparing to tell them. I had about $3,000 saved. I had documentation. I had a plan. And then Sam ruined the plan by making it simpler. He came to me and said he wanted to take a trip. He wanted to go to Costa Rica for Thanksgiving. He wanted a fresh start for our marriage, he said. He thought we'd been disconnected, and a romantic getaway would help us reconnect. It was the most obviously transparent manipulation I'd ever heard, and it made me realize how little he cared about whether I saw through him anymore. He didn't have to care about being seen. He had the power. But here's what he didn't know. I had contact information for my divorce attorney. I had the documentation I needed. I had a support system. And most importantly, I had clarity. I no longer had any desire to make this work or to preserve the relationship or to figure out how to save what we had. I told him I didn't want to go to Costa Rica. I told him I didn't want a fresh start. I told him I wanted a divorce. His response was immediate. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He told me I'd regret this. He told me I'd never make it without him. He told me he'd destroy me. He told me I'd end up alone and broke and unemployable. He told me I was nothing without him. And then I said something I'd never said before, something I didn't even know I had the capacity to say. We'll see. Leaving Sam was not dramatic. There was no screaming match where I grabbed a suitcase and stormed out. There was no scene. What there was instead was a legal process, which was simultaneously less cinematic and more brutal than any dramatic confrontation could have been. I filed for divorce on November 23, 2021, the day before Thanksgiving. My attorney filed the paperwork, and on the same day, I sent Sam an email, professionally worded copy to my attorney, informing him that he'd be receiving legal documents and that I was retaining an attorney to protect my interests. I had a bag packed. I went to work, and I didn't come home. Maggie picked me up from my office parking lot. I remember getting into her car, and the first thing she did was hug me, and the first thing I did was apologize for losing so many years, and the first thing she did was tell me to stop. She said I wasn't to blame for what happened. She said she was just happy I was alive and getting out, and everything else could be processed later. I stayed with Maggie for 3 weeks while I figured out my living situation. During those 3 weeks, Sam escalated exactly as I'd been warned he would. He called my work and told them I was unstable and that they should be concerned about my reliability. My company received the call but didn't act on it, which I learned later was because they'd had experience with a few situations like this, and they had procedures in place to not be manipulated by angry ex-partners. He called my parents and told them I was having a mental health crisis and that I'd abandoned him without explanation. He told them I was being influenced by manipulative friends. He told them I was throwing away our marriage for nothing. My parents called me, confused and frightened. This was the first real conversation I'd had with them about what was actually happening. I explained, as much as I could in the moment, that I was safe, that I was getting out of an unsafe situation, and that I would tell them everything soon. My mother's voice changed when I said unsafe. That's when she stopped asking questions and started listening. He froze the joint accounts. This was something my attorney had warned me might happen, but it happened faster than expected. I didn't have access to any of the money that we'd accumulated during our marriage. Every dollar I'd contributed, every dollar that had been designated for household expenses, all of it was gone from my access. It was strategically brilliant from a control perspective and also immediately illegal, as my attorney pointed out. But here's what he didn't understand. By that point, I'd already gathered what I needed to survive. I had my $3,000. I had my job. I had my support system. I was afraid, absolutely, but I was no longer trapped in the way I'd been before. Within a month, I'd secured a small apartment. It was in a safe neighborhood, it was affordable even on my reduced salary, and most importantly, it was mine. The lease was in my name. There was nothing on it that connected it to Sam. I could close the door and be alone with my thoughts for the first time in 5 years. The first night in my apartment, I sat on the floor. I didn't have furniture yet, just a mattress on the floor and some boxes of my things, and I looked around at the emptiness, and I felt something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief, exactly. It was a kind of suspended moment. I was free from one thing, but I wasn't yet anything else. I was in the space between what I'd been and what I would become. The divorce proceedings were ugly. Sam fought every single thing. He contested the fact that he'd controlled our finances, as if it was an accusation rather than a documented reality. He claimed I'd stolen money from our joint account, the $2,000 I'd saved, and that I should be required to repay it. He demanded spousal support despite out-earning me for most of our marriage. He made claims about my mental health and stability, which my therapist and my attorney quickly dismantled. The court sided with me on almost every count. The judge looked at the financial records and called them concerning. The judge listened to testimony from my therapist about coercive control. The judge looked at my documented career decline and the timeline of my employment changes and the reduction in my financial access, and he understood what had happened. Sam was ordered to restore my access to a portion of the joint account. He was not awarded spousal support. He was ordered to pay my attorney fees because the case had been contested without merit. He tried to appeal, but the appeal was quickly dismissed. By the spring of 2022, the divorce was final. I was 33 years old. I had an apartment. I had a job that paid less than I was worth. I had a support system. I had no savings. I had no retirement plan to speak of. I had 5 years of lost career trajectory. And I had my life back. The first thing I did after the divorce was finalized was sit down with my therapist and say, I need to rebuild myself completely. Not fix myself. Rebuild. What needs to happen? She said, everything. We started with the basics. I started eating regularly again. Not to become thinner or more attractive. Just to have enough calories to function. I started going to the gym, not to lose weight or change my body, but to remember what it felt like to be capable and strong. I started sleeping without waking up in panic. I started calling my parents more. Real calls, not the performative calls where I was pretending everything was fine. My mother was the first person I opened up to about the extent of the control. I told her about the money, the isolation, the reproductive coercion, the threats. She listened, and afterward, she said something I'll never forget. I'm so proud of you for getting out. I reconnected with my friends. Not just Maggie, but the others too. Mitchell, who Sam had told me was flighty and unreliable, turned out to be one of the most steady, consistent people I knew. Ren, who he'd said was too negative, was actually just real and honest about how the world worked. I'd lost 5 years with these people, and there was some grief in that, but there was also extraordinary generosity as they accepted me back into their lives without too many questions or too much judgment. But the most important rebuild was professional. I was still in the reduced position at my consulting firm. I was still making 20% less than I had before, with half the responsibility. The firm had brought someone else into the strategic role I'd left, and they seemed happy with the arrangement. But I wasn't going to stay there forever. I wasn't going to let my career be defined by the choices I'd made under duress. I started looking for jobs. Not immediately. I was too fragile for that yet. But by June 2022, I started putting out applications. I reframed my 5-year reduction in responsibility not as a failure, but as 5 years of hard-won expertise in operational efficiency. I talked about the leave of absence not as a breakdown, but as a period of deep professional reflection that had given me clarity about what I really wanted to do. I got 3 interviews. At the 3rd interview, with a firm that specialized in nonprofit consulting, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Catherine, and she was a senior partner who'd built the firm from scratch. She was in her 50s, and she had this presence that immediately made me feel like I was in the room with someone who'd figured something out about how to succeed without losing herself. At the end of the interview, Catherine asked me a question that wasn't on her list. She asked, "There's a 5-year gap in your career trajectory. Your resume explains it, but I want to hear directly from you what happened." And I could have lied. I could have given her the professional, sanitized version. But something about her made me feel like she would see through the lie anyway, so I told her the truth. I told her I'd been in a controlling relationship that had systematically undermined my career. I told her I was getting out of it and trying to rebuild. I told her that my skills were real and intact, and I was committed to proving it. She nodded like she'd been expecting this exact answer, and she said, "We have a program. It's for women who are re-entering the workforce after personal challenges. It's a 2-year leadership track. You'd be backfilled into a senior consulting role, but you'd also be getting management training, executive coaching, and access to a mentorship network. The pay is 30% above where you left off. Would you be interested?" I said yes before I could think about it too much. I started at the new firm in August 2022. This meant leaving the consulting firm where I'd spent years trying to maintain stability, where I'd slowly suffocated under my reduced role. Leaving meant I had to burn the bridge to that safety, but it was a bridge that was leading nowhere anyway. The first week at the new firm, I felt like an imposter. I felt like I was pretending to be someone capable when I was actually just a person who'd been systematically dismantled and was trying to piece myself back together. I felt fraudulent. Catherine called me into her office on Tuesday of that first week, and before I could explain what I was sure was about to happen, that they'd realized they'd made a mistake hiring me, she said, "You're doing great. I know you don't believe that yet, but you are. You're going to feel like an imposter for about 6 months. That feeling means you're growing. If you stopped feeling like an imposter, it would mean you'd stop challenging yourself. So keep feeling it, but know that it means you're exactly where you need to be. Over the next year, everything changed. Not immediately. Change isn't a sudden thing when you're rebuilding yourself from the ground up. It's gradual. It's incremental. It's 1,000 small choices that, when compiled, create a different trajectory. Within 3 months of starting at the new firm, I was brought into a strategic project. We were working with a network of homeless-serving nonprofits, and they had systems that were failing because they'd been built piecemeal over decades without integration. I was asked to design an integrated approach that could serve their needs without being so complex that it overwhelmed organizations with limited IT resources. I spent 2 months on that project, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the problem-solving. I fell in love with the nonprofit world. I fell in love with the feeling of my brain being challenged in ways that mattered. This wasn't abstract financial optimization for private equity firms. This was systems that affected actual human lives. I finished the project, and it was successful. The nonprofits implemented the system, and it improved their ability to coordinate services by 40%. That 40% translated to resources being stretched further, which translated to more people being served. I had done that. My brain had done that. My capability had done that. Catherine brought me into her office after the project finished and asked if I'd be interested in leading a new division. The firm was going to expand into offering consulting specifically to social impact organizations. She wanted me to head it. She wanted me to build it from the ground up. She was offering me partnership track within 5 years if I performed well. I was 34 years old. I was 6 months out of a divorce. I was living in an apartment I'd furnished gradually by shopping sales at West Elm and finding things on Facebook Marketplace. I was rebuilding everything. And I was being offered something I'd thought was gone forever. Partnership. I said yes. Over the next year, I did exactly what I'd been told I couldn't do. I built something. I built a division that went from 0 to 6 people to 12 people. I built processes. I built a culture. I built relationships with nonprofit leaders who trusted me. I built a business model that was profitable while still serving organizations that couldn't afford traditional consulting fees. I went from making $60,000 to making $120,000. More importantly, I went from being terrified of being unemployable to being aggressively recruited by other firms who'd heard about the work I was doing. I went from being someone whose entire professional identity had been controlled and restricted to being someone whose expertise was respected and valued. By 2024, I was making $170,000. I was leading a division with 15 people reporting to me. I was on track for partnership. I was being asked to speak at conferences about social impact consulting. I was being approached by nonprofits who wanted my specific expertise. And I was writing again. I started a blog again. Not the same blog I'd had before. This one was focused on systems thinking and nonprofit management, but it also included essays about rebuilding after trauma. I wrote about coercive control. I wrote about leaving. I wrote about what it meant to rebuild your professional identity after someone had systematically dismantled it. The blog started small, but it grew. 6 months in, I had 5,000 followers. Then 20,000. Then 50,000. People were reaching out to tell me that reading my essays had helped them recognize patterns in their own relationships. People were sharing my writing with friends they were worried about. My words were helping people. I met my therapist one day in late 2023, and I asked her when I could consider myself healed. She asked me what healing looked like to me. I said I wasn't sure. She said, "That's actually perfect. Because healing isn't a destination. It's not a place where you arrive and then you're done. Healing is when you can think about what happened and feel sad about it, but you're not consumed by it. Healing is when you can remember the pain without being in pain. Healing is when you can look back and see what he tried to make you and feel grateful that you didn't become that." I thought about that definition and I realized something. I was healed. Not because I'd forgotten what happened. Not because it didn't matter anymore. But because Sam had no power over my present. My success wasn't about proving him wrong. My success was about proving him irrelevant. In February 2024, 2.5 years after I'd left him, I saw Sam again. It wasn't intentional. Virginia is a city, but it's also surprisingly small, especially in certain professional circles. I was at a conference for nonprofit leaders and social impact consultants, speaking about systems integration in homelessness service networks. I'd given a keynote that morning. I'd been well received. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I was at the hotel bar afterward with some colleagues, celebrating the keynote, and I saw him walking through the lobby. For a second, I didn't recognize him. And then I did, and my heart did this strange thing where it jumped and then immediately settled. The jump was fear, that old reflexive fear. The settling was something new, indifference. He saw me at almost the same moment. I watched his face cycle through expressions, recognition, confusion, and then something that I can only describe as rage. He started walking toward me. My colleagues noticed. One of them, a woman named Dr. Patel, who was the head of another nonprofit, put her hand on my arm. I looked at her, and without saying anything, she understood. She stood up. By the time Sam reached me, there were 3 people standing with me. Sam stopped about 3 feet away from me. He looked older than he had 2 years ago. Harder. His hair was graying at the temples, and there were deep lines around his mouth. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because I could see, in his physical appearance, that whatever had happened in his life since I'd left hadn't made him better. He said, "You're looking well." I said, "Thank you." That was all.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to have a conversation with him. I wasn't going to engage beyond basic courtesy. But as he was standing there, I could see him processing the shift in my energy. I was no longer the woman he'd left. I was no longer anxious or desperate or trying to prove my value. I was simply a woman standing in a bar with colleagues at a conference where I'd just given a successful keynote, completely unbothered by his presence. He said, "I hear you've done quite well for yourself." I said, "I have." He said, "That's good. That's really good. I always knew you had potential." I looked at him, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not hatred, not even the satisfaction of revenge. What I felt was pity. I pitied him because he'd spent 5 years trying to diminish me, and it hadn't worked. I pitied him because his strategy had been to make me smaller, so he could feel bigger, and now I was standing here bigger than I'd ever been, and his smallness was suddenly so obvious it was almost painful to witness. I said, "I'm going to go back to my colleagues now. It was nice seeing you." I turned back to my group, and I sat down and I picked up my drink, and I continued the conversation I'd been having before he interrupted it. He stood there for another moment, and then he walked away. That night, I told Maggie about the encounter. She asked me how I felt. I said, "I feel like I finally understand what revenge actually is." She said, "What's that?" I said, "It's not about hurting them. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about becoming so completely undeniable that their existence becomes irrelevant to your story." He tried to write himself into my future, and I spent 5 years letting him. Now I've written him completely out. I want to pause here and say something that feels important. My story is not unique. It's particularly mine in its specific details, but the architecture of what happened to me is happening to women everywhere.
Right now.
As you're listening to this, there's a woman in Des Moines who is told by her husband that her ambition was threatening the stability of their family. There's a woman in Atlanta who has gradually moved to part-time work, then leave of absence, then unemployment, and when she tried to find work again, her husband became ill, and she had to care for him. There's a woman in Seattle who left her law career because her partner made it clear that his career was more important, and 3 kids later, she realized she'd lost 5 years and had to rebuild everything from scratch. The thing I want to emphasize is that Sam was not a cartoon villain. He was not a man who fit neatly into the cultural stereotype of an abuser. He was intelligent, articulate, accomplished, and respected. He had friends. He had a good job. By external measures, he was successful. And he was an abuser. This matters because we've built this cultural narrative where abuse looks a certain way, where it's obvious, where it's a man yelling or hitting or doing something we recognize immediately as unacceptable. But the most dangerous abuse is the kind that happens in normal light, with normal language, in normal relationships. The kind where you can't point to a single incident and say, that's it, that's the problem. Because the problem is the cumulative architecture of 1,000 small choices designed to restrict, control, and diminish. I want to speak to people who might be recognizing their own lives in my story. If you're listening and you're thinking, wait, he does that thing where he expresses concern about my career, or he controls the finances but says it's for my own good, or he makes me feel crazy for wanting things that don't include him, I want you to know something very clearly. You are not crazy. What you're experiencing is real. It's not love. It's not marriage. It's not compromise. It's control, and you deserve better. And I want to speak to people who are out of those situations and are trying to rebuild. This is what I want you to know. Your success will feel uncomfortable at first. You'll feel like you're betraying the narrative that was told about you. You'll feel like you're being disloyal by thriving. You'll feel like you're wrong for wanting things. That feeling is the residue of the control. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're healing. Your success is not revenge. Your success is reclamation. Your success is you taking back the parts of yourself that were given away or taken. Your success is the world confirming that you were right all along. You are capable, valuable, worthy of the space you take up, worthy of ambition, worthy of dreams that belong only to you. I'm sitting in my office. It's November 2024, almost exactly 3 years since I filed for divorce. My office is in Virginia, where I chose to stay even after I could have moved. I stayed because this city is part of my reclamation story. It's where I'd been diminished, but it's also where I rebuilt myself. My name is still Victoria Ashford, though there was a moment where I considered taking back my maiden name. I decided against it. Ashford is my name now. It's what I've built under. It's what I'm known for professionally. Reclaiming my maiden name would have felt like taking a step backward, and I'm not interested in going backward anymore. I'm making $280,000 now. I'm on track for partnership. My division has been so successful that the firm is opening offices in Denver, San Francisco, and Atlanta based on the model I built. I'm being approached by publishers about writing a book about systems thinking in nonprofit management. I'm being asked to sit on boards. I'm being valued. But here's the thing I want to emphasize. None of that is the most important part of my story. The most important part is that I can think about myself, my actual self, not the diminished version Marcus tried to create, but the whole, actual me, and I feel affection. I like myself. I like the way my mind works. I like that I'm ambitious. I like that I care about complex problems and stay focused until I solve them. I like that I'm loyal to my friends and that I've created a life that nourishes me. That's the real revenge. Not the money, though the money is nice. Not the success, though the success is validating. The real revenge is that I got myself back. I got back the woman who wanted things. I got back the woman who had dreams that belonged only to her. I got back the woman who took up space and wasn't sorry about it. I wrote 3 letters that I never sent. I want to read them to you now because I think they're important testimony to what it means to move through something like this and come out on the other side. The first letter was to Sam, written 6 months after I left him. It says, Isam, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why I let you diminish me for so long. I've looked for the moment where I made the decision to make myself smaller, but I'm realizing that there was no single decision. It was 1,000 decisions, each one adding up until I was so small, I barely existed. You told me I was nothing without you. What you actually meant was that I was nothing with you, and you needed me to believe that. You needed me to be empty so that you could fill the space, so that every achievement was yours and every failure was mine. I came into that marriage with trajectory. I had momentum. I had ambition. You didn't take those things from me. You convinced me to give them to you, and I did. That's the part I'm still processing. Not that you took, but that I gave. I participated in my own diminishment because I loved you, and I thought that's what love meant. I'm writing to tell you that I understand now. I understand that what you did was calculated. I understand that every compliment was a calculation. Every concern about my work-life balance was architecture. Every decision about money and isolation was strategy. And I'm writing to tell you that it doesn't matter anymore. You don't get to be the villain of my story anymore. You've been written out entirely. My present is so full of my own achievement that there's no room for you in it. I'm not forgiving you. I don't need to forgive you. I just need to move forward, and I am.
Victoria.
The second letter was to myself. I wrote it 3 months into my recovery. It says,
Dear Victoria.
I know you're scared. I know you're lying awake at night wondering if you made a terrible mistake, if you've destroyed your life, if you're going to end up alone and broke and unemployable, just like he said. I know that you're still hearing his voice in your head when you make decisions. I know that you still feel like you don't have the right to take up space. I know that you're uncomfortable being successful because you learned that success meant being threatening, and being threatening meant being hurt. I'm writing to tell you that all of that is going to change. Not immediately, but it will change. You're going to find your voice again. You're going to remember what it feels like to want things and not apologize for wanting them. You're going to build a life that's so completely yours that you'll forget what it felt like to have your life dictated to you. The version of you that he created, the diminished version, the scared version, the version that apologized for taking up space, that wasn't real. She was a costume you wore, and now it's time to take it off. Who you are underneath is brilliant. Who you are underneath is capable. Who you are underneath is worthy of the ambition that burns inside you. The real revenge isn't about hurting him. The real revenge is becoming so completely yourself that his absence becomes irrelevant. You're going to get there.
Trust me.
I'm you from the future, and I'm telling you, you're going to be okay. You're going to be better than okay. You're going to be everything he said you couldn't be.
Hold on. Victoria.
The third letter was to my parents, written just before I made my partnership track official. I did send this one. Dear Mom and Dad, I wanted to write this to tell you that I understand what you were trying to do when I was growing up. I understand that you worked those double shifts and sacrificed those things not because you were trying to burden me with expectations, but because you believed in my potential. You believed that I could reach higher. I'm writing to tell you that you were right. And I'm also writing to tell you that there were years, long years, when I forgot that. When I let someone convince me that reaching higher was selfish, that ambition was a character flaw, that wanting things for myself was betrayal. I'm on track for partnership now. I'm leading a division that's helping thousands of people. I'm making more money than I ever thought I would. And more than that, I'm happy. I'm happy in a way that I'd forgotten was possible. I think you should know that I got here partly because of what you taught me, and partly because I had to unlearn everything that was taught to me about whether I deserved to be here. I love you. And I'm sorry it took me so long to remember how to reach.
Victoria.
I want to talk about something that's been gnawing at me throughout this entire process. The nature of revenge and why I chose not to have it. For a long time, I thought that revenge meant making him feel what I felt. I thought it meant exposing what he'd done, making him suffer consequences, making sure that everyone knew what he was. I thought that would be satisfying. I thought that would make the pain retroactively make sense. But here's what I discovered. Revenge like that keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you. It requires that you stay focused on them, stay angry at them, stay energized by the project of hurting them. It requires that they matter to you, even if in a negative way. The real revenge, the revenge that actually works, is to make them irrelevant. It's to live so completely outside of their sphere of influence that your success becomes impossible for them to touch. It's to become so undeniably brilliant that their accusations can't stick. It's to build a life so full of meaning that their absence becomes a non-event. I think about Sam sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. And when I do, I don't feel hate. I don't feel anger. I feel something closer to pity, which is worse than hate, actually, because pity acknowledges that someone has become small enough that they can't hurt you anymore. Pity is what you feel when someone is no longer a threat. The most gracious thing I can do for myself is to not give him the attention of my hatred. My hatred would be a gift to him, actually. It would mean he still mattered enough for me to feel intensely about. Instead, I'm giving him something much worse: indifference. I'm moving forward with my life, and I'm not looking back, and that looks like apathy from the outside, but it's actually the ultimate form of moving on. Before I close, I want to come back to the question I asked at the beginning. I asked you where you were listening from. I asked if you were in your car, in your bedroom, in a place you'd claimed as your own. And I want to speak to you directly now, with the understanding that you might be listening to this story because you need to hear it. If you're listening from a place of fear, from a place where someone has made you believe you're nothing without them, I want you to know that they're lying. You're not nothing. You have never been nothing. What they've done is create a cage made of words and rules and control, and they've told you that the cage is normal, that it's what love looks like, that it's what commitment looks like. You can leave. You don't know how yet. You don't know what comes next. You don't know if you'll be able to survive financially or emotionally or socially. But you can leave. It's possible. People do it. I did it, and I'm here to tell you, it's worth it. If you're listening and you're already out, if you're already in the process of rebuilding, I want you to know that the hardest part is behind you. The part that takes the most courage. The part where you have to believe in yourself even when you're terrified. The part where you have to take action despite the fear. That part is done. Now you just have to show up every single day and slowly remind yourself of who you actually are. You're going to feel like an imposter for a while. You're going to feel like you don't deserve the success that comes. You're going to wait for someone to call you out, to reveal that you're a fraud. That feeling is normal. It's the residue of someone else's attempt to make you feel small. Don't believe it. You earned everything you're getting. You're capable. You're worthy. You deserve to take up space. And if you're listening and you're none of those people, if you're safe and you're stable and you're not sure why you're listening to a story about leaving, I want you to know that this story is also for you. It's for you to understand what's happening to people around you. It's for you to recognize the patterns of control so that when you see them in a friend's life or a family member's life, you can speak up. It's for you to know that abuse doesn't look like a monster. It looks like someone who's very good at disguising control as concern. It looks like love that's actually ownership. When I think about my marriage to Sam, I don't think about it as a failure anymore. I can't think of it as a failure because failure implies that there was potential for something good that went wrong. But from the beginning, his intention was control. His intention was ownership. His intention was to take a woman with trajectory and reduce her to an accessory to his life. I think about it now as what it was, a years-long project of abuse wrapped in the language of love. And I think about my leaving as what it was, the greatest act of self-love I could have performed. I saved my own life. That might sound dramatic, but when I say it, I mean it literally. If I'd stayed, if I'd had the child he wanted me to have, if I'd continued to allow him to control every aspect of my existence, I wouldn't have survived. Not physically, maybe, but definitely spiritually. I would have disappeared completely. The person I might have become doesn't exist because I chose to become the person I was supposed to be instead. I'm not going to tell you that I'm over it, because that implies there's a moment where you move past trauma and it no longer exists. That's not how it works. What's true is that I've integrated it. I've taken what happened to me and I've made it part of my story in a way that doesn't define me. What happened to me is not who I am. I'm a woman from rural New Mexico whose parents worked themselves to exhaustion so she could have opportunities. I'm a consultant who specializes in helping nonprofits build systems that serve human beings. I'm a writer who's telling her story so that other people can understand themselves better. I'm a leader. I'm an achiever. I'm ambitious without apologizing for it. I'm also a woman who is married to someone who tried to erase her, and I'm a woman who refused to be erased. That last part doesn't define me, but it's important to acknowledge because there are people listening who need to understand what's possible. There are people listening who need to know that you can escape. You can rebuild. You can become everything you were supposed to be. I want to end with this. The title of this video is He Said I Was Nothing Without Him. I made him watch me become everything. But that's not actually accurate. He didn't watch me become everything. He lost the ability to watch me the moment I left. He lost the ability to be part of my story. The real title of this story is something simpler, something more profound. I became everything without him. That's the distinction I've come to understand. Revenge, real revenge, isn't about making someone suffer. Real revenge is building a life so completely full of meaning and achievement and joy that the person who tried to destroy you becomes a footnote. A small footnote. An asterisk in the vast landscape of your success. I'm not defined by what was done to me. I'm defined by what I did about it. I'm defined by the choice I made to believe that something better was possible. I'm defined by the work I've done to rebuild myself, and the work I continue to do every single day to be the best version of myself. I want to make sure you understand, this isn't a story about happily ever after. It's not like I rebuilt myself, and now everything is perfect. I still struggle sometimes. I still have moments where I hear his voice in my head, telling me I'm too ambitious, too much, too loud. I still sometimes catch myself apologizing for things I shouldn't apologize for. I still sometimes feel the ghost of the anxiety that lived in my chest for 5 years. But here's the difference. Those moments are no longer defining. They're no longer the main narrative. They're minor interruptions in a life that's become predominantly full of achievement, friendship, purpose, and joy. And that shift from being predominantly diminished to being predominantly thriving, that's the shift that matters. For anyone listening who's in a situation similar to mine, I want to give you some practical advice that's based not on theory, but on lived experience. First, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Our bodies know before our minds catch up. If you feel anxious around someone, if you feel smaller around them, if you have to monitor your words and your behavior to keep them happy, that's information. That's your nervous system telling you something is wrong. Second, document everything. If you're afraid of someone, if you suspect manipulation or control, start keeping records. Write down what happened and when. Save emails. Take screenshots. Create a record of the pattern. This sounds paranoid, but if you ever need to prove what happened, documentation is everything. Third, build a support system in secret if you have to. Reach out to old friends. Find a therapist.
Talk to your family.
Do this carefully, but do it. You need people who know what's happening, people who can help you see things clearly, people who will support you when you're ready to leave. Fourth, get financial independence. Even if it's small, even if it's just a bank account with a few $1,000s in it, have access to money that's yours alone. This is crucial. You cannot leave safely without financial resources.
Period.
Fifth, have a plan before you leave. Know where you're going. Know how you'll support yourself. Know what legal options are available to you.
Talk to a lawyer. Understand your rights. Don't leave blind.
Sixth, when you leave, don't explain yourself. Don't try to make them understand.
Don't negotiate.
You've already made your decision. Execute it. The moment you start trying to convince someone to let you leave, you've given them back the power. And seventh, believe in yourself. Believe that you're capable of rebuilding. Believe that you're worthy of success. Believe that your ambition is not a character flaw. Believe that taking up space is not selfish. Believe that the life you want is possible. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for taking an hour and a half of your life to hear about my journey. Thank you for witnessing my truth. Thank you for caring enough to understand. I want to leave you with this. Whatever you're going through right now, whatever situation you're in, whatever fear you're carrying, it's not permanent. It's not forever. It's a season. And seasons change. If you're suffering, you have options. You might not see them right now. They might feel impossible. But they exist. Other people have found them. You will too. If you're safe, please use that safety to help someone who isn't. Be the person who listens without judgment. Be the person who believes. Be the person who says you can leave when someone needs to hear it. I'm going to close now, but I want you to know you matter. Your life matters. Your dreams matter. Your ambition matters. Everything about you, the parts that shine and the parts that are still in shadow, all of it matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone take it away. Don't let anyone make you believe that you're nothing. Because you're not nothing. You're everything. You're a human being with intrinsic value, and the only person who gets to decide what that means is you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of the story. And thank you for being part of your own story.
Keep going.
You're going to be okay. More than okay.
And if you love real-life stories with tough choices, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.